Today we are jumping into Unit 2, Day 4. Today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment and Slavery. And I always like to mix and talk about these two things together because I think that this is one of the great contrasts that you can make in history. That at the same time in the world, in what will become the United States here, we are having the Great Awakening, a religious revival throughout the world, at least Western Europe, and then that filters over the colonies. We're having the Enlightenment, this great enlightenment happening of thought, new ways of thinking about government. And then at the same time, we're having something that's very contradictory to all that happening, which is the practice of slavery. And that's why I mix those two things together and talk about them on the same day. So let's jump right in to discussing, first of all, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. So one of the key things and the reason that we discuss the Great Awakening is because you're going to see the ideas and concepts spread during the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment are going to help bring the colonists closer to a state of rebellion, which is why they are considered so important. I do have another little bit for you to watch from God in America from the PBS miniseries. Go ahead and check that out, and it's going to talk a little bit about the Great Awakening. So what was the Great Awakening? This was a movement rooted in spiritual growth, which brought national identity to colonial America. And what we mean with that is it's going to be a religious revival that happens, but the big thing that it's going to serve is bringing the colonies together and uniting them in that way. You're going to see that as a result of the Great Awakening, that certain Christians start to disassociate themselves with certain approaches to worship and certain things that the church were doing during that time. You see people start to gather together in large gatherings for days at a time to worship and prayer. And the reason for this is that people felt that to this point, or at least what they were experiencing, that religion was very dry, dull, and distant. If you think about all of the ceremony and that kind of thing within the Roman Catholic Church and even the Anglican Church, people kind of got tired of that, and they felt like it didn't really connect and wasn't super personal to them. Also, you're going to start to see preachers felt like that people needed to be concerned with inner emotions versus the outward religious behavior. They said, hey, versus going and showing off for everyone and showing them how religious it is, are you really changed on the inside? Like, has this really changed you as a person, or are you just doing this for show? Another thing, too, is that people in New England area can now read and interpret the Bible for themselves. You see an individualistic view of this versus an institutionalized view of the Bible. So that's going to be the reasons for the Great Awakening. And really, it's a Great Awakening in that people are realizing that, hey, I can experience God on my own. I don't have to do what the Anglican Church tells me or what these other people tell me. Like, I can experience God on my own, and I can read the Bible and interpret it on my own as well. So some key people from the Great Awakening, one of them, George Whitefield. He was a big name preacher in London who made many trips over to America to preach. He was called a giant in the pulpit because of his booming voice and the authority that is shown here. When he does come to America, he becomes an itinerant evangelist, traveling around all over the place, and he is given credit for beginning the Great Awakening and really starting that whole religious movement. In fact, Ben Franklin, a guy who was known not to be super religious, he actually went and saw Reverend Whitefield in 1739. And this is a quote that he said afterwards. He said, "I happened soon after to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with a collection," meaning a money collection. "And I silently resolved he should get nothing from me. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 Spanish coins in gold. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that and determined to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all." And that just showed how moving of a speaker that Whitefield was, that he was able to accomplish that for Ben Franklin here, and was able to soften him up so much that he decides to donate all the money that he had in his pocket on that day. Another one is going to be Jonathan Edwards. This is a famous painting known as Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. If you want to pause this and take a look at it, this is a portrayal of what hell would look like, and it is based off of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon. So let's jump into talking about Jonathan Edwards. He was very famous for this Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God speech. And when he preached, he was more focused on, more hell-focused and intended to scare sinners into salvation. And you'll be able to get that from this quote here. Here's a quote from his sermon. "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or other loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you. His wrath towards you burns like a fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire." And again, this description of God just holding you over hell, just waiting to drop you in because he is so disgusted with you. Again, Jonathan Edwards, a very emotional and very good speaker during that time. And he was able to convert a lot of people based on his descriptions and his almost scaring people into accepting and believing in God and the principles that he was pushing for. And this is something, too, that is still taught today. If you're in English 11, you will probably read that this year. So what are some outcomes of the Great Awakening? You're going to see the birth of deep religious convictions in the colonies. Again, people had that already, but this was a reawakening of that within people. Colonists would now be bold when confronting religious authority and break away if they were not meeting expectations. So this is one of the reasons why the Great Awakening is so important, because it is challenging the traditional religion during that time. And because of that, it's changing the way that people viewed authority. If you remember, people often during this time, because of the close relationship between the religion of the time and government, people viewed them as one and the same. So when you start challenging the religion, which people saw as intertwined with the government, in a roundabout way, you are also challenging the government as well. And now people are starting to see like, hey, power within the church doesn't reside with with the church itself. It rests with God and through the Bible and that kind of thing. And so people started applying that as well to politically and saying, hey, maybe the power doesn't reside within any English monarch, but actually with the people governing and the control coming from the people versus that. So you do see that change happening, and people consider this laying those social foundations for the American Revolution. With this also, you're going to have the Enlightenment. So whereas the Great Awakening was more of a spiritual revival, you have the Enlightenment dealing with specific scientific and intellectual reasoning. And it's also known as the Age of Reason. You've probably learned about this in the past. It started over in Europe with the intellectuals there and made its way to America. It would begin in the late 17th, early 18th century. Here in America, Ben Franklin is considered the father of the Enlightenment here. And often you're going to see thoughts and ideas were spread in salons, which today we'd almost consider that kind of like a bar type atmosphere where people would sit down and discuss things all together, and they would discuss, politics and that kind of stuff. So some major Enlightenment ideas you're going to see is one thing is that the Enlightenment thinkers believe that every problem could be solved through the use of reason and the scientific method. So it's taking that and applying that to the problems of society. So more so during this time versus looking to maybe the church or God to an answer, they're saying, hey, let's look at reason and scientific method. And a lot of times they would intertwine that with teachings of the church. But they said, hey, how can we solve problems through this? You're also going to have new ideas with government. The idea that governments are created to secure an orderly society and promote individual welfare. The idea now that government is for the people. It's not for anything else. It's for the people and to help protect the people and promote their welfare. Also, you're going to see Montesquieu, who writes about the separation of powers and writes about how that is the best way to protect human liberties. Obviously, that will have a huge impact on our system as our whole system is set up on separation of powers. And you can see here in this chart some major ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers during that time. Idea of natural rights from John Locke. We just mentioned Montesquieu, freedom of thought and expression from Voltaire, and religious freedom, which also came from Voltaire. And you can see the impact specifically here that they had on our Bill of Rights, on our Constitution, on the Declaration of Independence. So again, looking at that question and thinking about it, we see that both of these two things, again, get people challenging that old guard and the way that that was, and that is what leads them eventually into challenging British authority here in the colonies. So again, when you're comparing and contrasting the two of these, you'll see Enlightenment focuses more on thought and science versus on religious ideas. The Enlightenment, again, focuses on and impacts government, whereas Great Awakening focuses more on religion. And with that, both of them play a major role in developing individualism, which is the idea that people can think on their own and determine what is best for them, and that it won't be passed down from a religious or a governmental authority. And individualism, you'll see, is something that is very deeply rooted within the American spirit. And I think that's why when you look at the history here and the pushback that people generally have against government is because America is in a way, we are very much focused on self and individualism, and that we can do it on our own. We don't need government telling us how to do it. We can govern ourselves how we feel best for that. So that brings us to slavery. And again, I put these two together because it is a great contrast. When you're having the Enlightenment talking about freedom, freedom for people to make their own decisions. And on the other side of it, you have slavery, which is a group of people not being able to make decisions for their own and being forced to work and live for somebody else. So it is a great contrast that you have there between these two thoughts. And it's interesting. I encourage you, if you ever have the chance, to go back and do some reading into this, into the justification of both sides. And because the thoughts behind it is very, very interesting, how people are able to get to that and basically almost, reckon the two sides with each other of pushing for individual freedom, but at the same time having something as oppressive as slavery. Today, you're going to be looking at several primary sources on slavery. I encourage you to look at those and really study them. I love bringing these forward whenever I can because I think that we tend to talk about slavery, but not really realize the impact of slavery and how devastating it was for the people during that time. So really look at, study those, and then do what you're supposed to do there and the instructions for them. So beginning of the African slave trade, we've mentioned this before. At first, you're going to see that European traders would have a positive impact on Africans because they would trade them products in Africa. But by the late 15th and early 16th century, Europeans became involved in the slave trade. Partially because of that the partial reason because of that is because in West Africa, you had a lot of tribes there that would take over another tribe, and then they would sell off these war captives and criminals from one African kingdom to another. And then they started doing that, selling them to the Europeans. And you're going to see, as we mentioned before, also the Portuguese were the first to widely use African slaves. So what would be the effect on Africans? The growth of agriculture here in North America would lead to Africans being used to work on plantations, both in the South and the Caribbean. Slavery, though, wasn't just restricted to the South. You did have some of that in the New England and the Middle colonies as well. You're also going to see that trade in the New England colonies was also dependent upon an unfree labor force, slaves as well. And even though, as we go on, you're going to see a lot of the New England colonies and the middle colonies and in our early states, they banned slavery. They still benefited off the slave system that the South was using during that time. We've already mentioned, too, that the first Africans were brought against their will to Jamestown in 1619 to work on tobacco plantations, is eventually where they ended up. The British at first oversaw the slave system, and you'll see by 1750, half of Virginia's population and 2/3 of South Carolina's population were enslaved laborers. So when we start talking about the Constitution and talking about counting the residents of a state towards the representation of it, you're going to see why in the South that is so important because of the level at which the slave population was of the regular population. So laws concerning slaves. In 1641, you'll see Massachusetts would be the first colony to recognize the enslavement of lawful captives. And then by 1661, you will have Virginia enact legislation stating that children automatically inherited their mother's enslaved status for life. And really, that is where you get the start of the slave system here in Virginia, is this idea that if someone's a slave and they have a child, that child is also a slave. And if you think about it from the slave owner's perspective, now they have a way of basically ensuring a constant supply of slaves. And that's why they pushed for and wanted this. In 1664, Maryland declared that baptism did not affect an enslaved person's status and that white women could not marry African American men. So you're going to see that the laws, instead of starting out like super harsh and restrictive, they would actually grow and become more harsh and restrictive as the time went on within the colonies. So what were the effects of the 1620s sugar revolution? This would be centered in Brazil and the West Indies. Europeans would run this whole system. And really, with growing the sugar in Brazil and the West Indies, they needed a massive amount of slaves in those areas. So you're going to see that slave catching systems would be put in place by both the French and the British and import 10,000 slaves a year into these areas. In the 1620s, the Dutch would introduce sugar to the English and French settlements in the West Indies, and the same would happen there. You would have a lot of slaves imported into those areas from Africa. So the big effect of the sugar revolution is the importation of more slaves. As a result of this, though, you're going to see that sugar would become the most profitable crop in Europe and the Americas during this time, which meant more wealth for Europe, an increase in the slave trade, and really tragedy for West Africa because as we'll talk about in a little bit, you're going to see that the conditions in these areas was generally terrible, and slaves would die quite frequently, which meant that they just needed to continue importing even more, which was bad for culture in Africa. So what was the impact of the Middle Passage? The Middle Passage would be that passage between Africa and the New World here that brought slaves here. And the Middle Passage and just the importation of slaves in general would change West African society. It would promote more centralized states and military conquests. As remember, military conquests, they could sell more slaves to the European traders. Tribes and kingdoms would participate in this system in order to gain wealth and power, causing divisions and classes there. And you would also see a huge imbalance of the sexes because mostly they wanted men to work on the plantations here in the New World, which led to a lack of men, which actually led to polygamy in some areas in Africa. Of course, the dignity of human life would not be respected in Africa and West, as people, again, viewed these African slaves not as people, but more as like a piece of farm equipment. So basically just as property, which meant that their life didn't mean very much to the people that were ruling over them in a way. The Middle Passage itself was a terrible experience. You'd have a large number of Africans that would die on the Middle Passage. Just imagine how you would feel. Somebody came in and ripped you out of the United States today and took you to a foreign country. You'd probably be pretty upset and devastated and really not know what to expect. And also, the sugar plantations was a lot of hard work. Now, in Virginia and Maryland, the slave system within Virginia and Maryland, you had the development of a slave society. You had a lot of slaves imported in here, and slavery was defined in basically racial terms. But you're going to see that within Virginia and Maryland, because the work here, working on tobacco farm, while it is very hard work, you're not having the same level of death that you're having in rice plantations and in sugar plantations. So planters are able to encourage reproduction amongst their slaves. And that's why you're going to see the slave numbers in Virginia and Maryland really grow exponentially, is not due to importation, but due to reproduction amongst the slaves and the slaves having families. And again, slave families is going to be something you're going to see more often in Virginia and Maryland, Chesapeake colonies. The South Carolina slave system, again, South Carolina slaves were very, very oppressed because of how rice was grown and because I've talked about before how diseases spread very quickly. And because of all these deaths and few births, again, in South Carolina, they weren't able to develop a really good slave society. And because they were constantly importing new slaves into South Carolina and into the Indies and that kind of thing, that led to a re-Africanized society, which basically meant is it was hard to develop a culture and a society within South Carolina because you're constantly having new people come in from Africa, which meant new languages, new ways of doing things. So it's harder for the slave communities there to make a cohesive society because of that importation of new slaves. Now, what was African American life like here in the colonies? You will see that slaves initially didn't regard each other as Africans or blacks, but they saw each other as members of a family, a clan, or a people. And again, that comes from those tribal feelings that they would have brought over from Africa with them. Again, in order to make a African American community here, you would need a common language and an equal gender ratio to create that community. Again, so that you could have families come out of that, but also having that common language and a way to communicate and share customs with each other. You will see, though, that Africans continued to bring with their culture. They continue to practice a lot of that things with their religion, their housing, their decorations, their music, and that kind of stuff. The Africans, even though they were in a pretty terrible situation here, that they were able to keep some of those things that they had from Africa that they held on to. Now, things like religion, they would eventually mix in Christianity with a lot of their African religions and that kind of thing. But you will see that despite the terribleness that was slavery and the treatment that they had, the Africans worked their best to try to create some semblance of normalcy in a situation that can't be considered very, very normal. So again, I hope you understand the great contradiction between these two things. Slavery is something we will come back to quite frequently in this class, and the contradiction of that within society, not just in the colonies during that time, but also worldwide, where you're having things change. And it's almost like we're in this precipice of the old world versus the new world. And people are trying to hold on to the old, which is the idea of slavery and some other things that they were holding on to as well. So I hope you all have a great day. And again, I encourage you to really look at and study those slave documents today.